Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining another episode of the PM Learning Series. My name is Shivi. I am the host for this show. Please drop in the chat where you're joining us from. And the PM Learning Series is a series of live streaming events where we talk to industry thought leaders and product practitioners to share their career journeys, as well as lessons learned about building great products to inspire current and aspiring product builders like you to level up your product career and build better products. Please make sure you subscribe to our newsletter in the event details page to receive recap of key takeaways from today's event, as well as future event updates. Today, we have a very exciting guest to talk about a topic that we actually haven't really explored till this point. We have 30 episode. This is the 30th episode of PM Learning Series, but this topic is so important and so critical that we should really double down on. And so for folks who are joining us, thank you. I see Robbie's joining us from Menlo Park, Adoop from Nigeria, Redwood City, Boulder, India, UK. I think Amania, Vancouver and Miami Beach. Thank you so much, folks. Continue to say hi, drop in the chat where you're joining us from. And today, our guest is Karan, who is a seasoned product leader specialized in building and monetizing enterprise SaaS business and multi-sided marketplaces. As the chief product officer at Brex, he leads the company's product portfolio expansion efforts. Previously, Karan ran the Meta's business products group, which served more than 200 million customers globally. This is really exciting, Karan. We're going to double click on some of that because it's so impactful about growing enterprise product, driving a global business. And so prior to Meta, Karan spent about 15 years in Microsoft, where he led the product management strategy for the company's Azure cloud and developer platform efforts. Outside of work, Karan mentors startups and entrepreneurs. Thank you so much for joining us today, Karan.
Thanks for having me here, Shivi. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And we have a lot of folks joining us, some from Milan, Italy, quite a few folks from Italy. Consider it's Friday dinner time. And so thank you for joining us. Folks from Toronto, Nepali. So really exciting. Thank you so much for such an international crowd. We have a lot to learn from you, Karan. One thing I want to comment, and we'll circle back, is your bookshelf. And let's make sure that it's a real one. And so just speaks to how knowledgeable you are. And I can't wait to, a later part of the talk to double down on some of your favorite books about building products and your recommendation. But before that, maybe let's start with the basic, right? Tell us a little bit about your career journey. What was your path to product management? And we know that you work at some of the iconic companies, during the tech boom, like at Microsoft and Meta, and now leading product teams at Brex. Just maybe walk us through a little bit about your career journey, how you got into product, kind of what gets you most excited about building product.
Indeed. And yes, we will definitely talk about the bookshelf in the background as well. And this is my favorite device, my Oculus Quest 2 as well there. Shivi, I'm one of the few lucky ones who got to do product right out of school. So I didn't have to go through the traditional, like, hey, I was an engineer who converted, even though I did start or study engineering. But I think the part I got lucky was I started working at Microsoft very early as an early product manager and grew through the ranks there. And the fun part of my Microsoft experience was building their cloud business, which is now known as Azure. When I started on it, and I'm going to date myself by saying that, there was no name Azure. It was an internal code name called Red Dog. And that finally became what the company is known for today. So a great ride at Microsoft, almost 14 years there. And then at some point I was like, if I don't leave now, I'll never leave. I'll be the dinosaur of Microsoft. So I pushed myself, and I usually blame my wife for it because she used to be in Bay Area. I was in Seattle, and I blamed my move to Bay Area on her. But there was also a time I got a chance to move to Facebook, and it was a blast. I primarily left Microsoft to do Facebook because I wanted to do something different than enterprise. So I went from enterprise to a consumer business, massive shift, learned a whole bunch of new business models, including advertising and like just building out crazy engagement on a 1 billion+ people platform. But during my time at Meta as well, I got back into building enterprise software all over again. And looks like, that's going to be part of my DNA forever. So we did a bunch of, new products like Workplace, build our business messaging, and ran large parts of the ads team. So the 250 million businesses we got to support was probably my highlight, where you can have such a massive impact to real people, real lives, real incomes by doing that. So that was fun. But I think in 2021, I was like, maybe it's time to go figure out how small companies work and what does truly mean to be in startup. It might have felt like a startup, but then startups have other interesting constraints. So that brought my most recent part of the journey to Brex. And Brex is a fascinating fintech company where deep roots in serving startups, growing upmarket heavily to serve enterprises. So we're an amazing intersection of a fintech company serving still B2B, serving startups, all the way to serving the most demanding enterprise SaaS companies. And here, I got a chance to re-sharpen my skills of how do you build brand new 0 to 1 enterprise products. What does it take to go build new SaaS businesses in a disruptive marketplace? So it's been a fun ride across consumer ads and enterprise, but heavily enterprise though.
That's awesome. I really like that because there's so many things we can double click. First, the consumer versus enterprise experience, and then the experience sort of growing different business models for enterprise, right? And then you also talk about, kind of like how do you scale fast and grow up market. So let's get started. So first thing, enterprise, sometimes building enterprise software because of the traditions, I think from the 90s to like early 2000, enterprise compared to consumer tend to have this sort of not necessarily negative vibe, but like a less sexy, exciting vibe compared to consumer product, right? But it's where the money is. But in your sort of like 15, 20 years growing, enterprise software, what would you say are some of the unique characteristics of enterprise software, and how have things changed, over the past 2-3 decades, and what gets you most excited about building enterprise software?
Indeed. I think if you're successful, one day I can wear this T-shirt that says "I made enterprise sexy again." To your point, it doesn't get considered sexy at all because it doesn't have the same scale as most people think in terms of like, oh, you can do 1 billion people's consumer software. But I think there's one first, especially if a lot of product people are watching this, there are a lot of things which are common. So I want to make sure people don't forget that passion, customer obsession, those things always remain true no matter whether you're doing consumer or enterprise. But I think there are 3 big differences which are worth keeping in mind when you think about enterprise B2B software. One, and probably obvious but often ignored, is when you're building enterprise software, you have a buyer and you have a user. And sometimes those are very conflicting requirements because what your buying team, whether it's IT or procurement or finance in our case, needs very different what the employees need, which are probably the users on most part. So I think understanding that there are 2 very different cohorts of people you need to serve is critical, because it's very easy to ignore one and then you're like, why is my product not selling? Because you never really built it for the buyer because nobody bought it. So I think that's one dimension, and we can double click more into why in the enterprise software, serving the needs of both the buyer and the user is actually a very critical thing to get right. The second actually is probably more interesting in terms of how you build the software itself. The feedback loops that we're so used to in the consumer world of like, oh, I can just open up an A/B test and 50% of my traffic goes, a few million people try it out and have feedback, and I can look at data. That doesn't always work. Obviously, the more data you can use, the better it is. But sometimes, and a lot of times, especially if you're building a new 0 to 1 enterprise product, a lot of your feedback loop will come from deep one-on-one connections with your early adopters. And it's a very different way of building and co-creating products in the enterprise space, especially if you're early. If you're Microsoft, if you're one of the big guys, you have a giant customer base to go work with. But when you're a smaller company trying to get it off the ground, your feedback loops have to be tuned for enterprise customers to co-create with them. And the third and the most interesting part for me is, people think enterprise software is boring. And that's the reason why we're going to spend a lot of time in actually building, consumer grade enterprise. And I think that was one of the things when I joined Brex was, hey, the last app you would remember of expense management was Concur. And not to throw anyone under the bus, but that was 1993. And I'm pretty sure half the people watching this podcast were not even born then. So that is when the last innovation happened in the space. And that was designed only for, an old school system, which is like, hey, it's forms over data. And now there's AI, there's amazing forms, everything is mobile. So you can still bring a lot of that. And the more you make consumer grade software in enterprise, that's the best enterprise software to go build. So marrying consumer and enterprise is possible in enterprise, which typically won't happen. So I would say those would be the three biggest ones to focus on when thinking about making a shift to enterprise or building it from scratch.
I love that. Let's double click on some of them. Let's start with the first, buyer versus user, right? So many times, sometimes buyer have specific requirements that are not how users would use it. But Slack is a good example of sort of bottoms up, like product led growth, land and expand. And so so what's your take on like best practices or common pitfalls around how do you make sure that the buyers and user, like how do you make trade-off decisions when they're misaligned? Is there cases when they're misaligned? How do you navigate those? And then how do you make sure that you build something that users love and buyer would actually pay for what they want to use?
Yeah, and I think you use a great example, Shivi, which is Slack. And I'll just build on that example because obviously, it's a pretty well-known product. And if you ask people, is Slack a success or not? And you'll hear very, very strong opinions on both sides of the spectrum. And I think what Slack really points to is a fundamental understanding of how you will sell is how your product needs to be built. And most people forget that, I'll build a product and then somebody will figure out how to sell it. But product-led growth, products which are built with PLG in mind, needs to be fundamentally different initially on how you build an enterprise sales-led product, which is high touch, high deployment. And eventually, you can have both and it converge, but where you start is really, really important. So I think Slack is a perfect example of build for the user. In fact, almost skip IT if you can, but, and then work around them, or what we used to call shadow IT. Even we tried that in the Azure days of Microsoft, and very quickly realized that PLG only gets you so far. A fun stat, about 70% of all B2B SaaS revenue is made out of 2,000 companies. It is nuts. Trillions of dollars comes from only just like top 2,000 companies paying for SaaS. So at some point, if you really want to be a credible player in the B2B SaaS world, you do need to go beyond just PLG into an enterprise SaaS motion. And when that happens, your business model needs to be different. You need to think about the buyer. You need to make sure you don't have like a 3-year backlog. And this is exactly where Slack got stuck. And Teams, unfortunately, came in and fundamentally disrupted Slack. Was they had very little relationship with doing partner channels, enterprise sales motions, customization of buyer, making sure the IT buyer is taken care of. So I think that's a great question that you had, Shivi. Think about how you're going to sell and make sure that your product is designed for either PLG or for enterprise sales motion to start with. And then you're converging very quickly so you don't end up in massive debts, which will stop you from going into adjacent markets.
That I like that. I think, besides Slack, Figma and Miro are kind of a good example. But like you said, I like the way how you sequence the loops. I think it's what makes the difference here, right? You start with PLG, that's sort of end user centric. So you build something that people will use and love using. I love Figma and Miro, both are good examples. But then you kind of layer on top all the sales motion, what it takes to sell, to satisfy some of the buyers in order to go into that market. Otherwise, just relying on bottoms up, you can only do so much. Like you said, relationship matters, I think, in the B2B business. So I also wanted to maybe talk about, we'll transition into business models. But before we go there, you also mentioned how the feedback loop is very different, right? Unlike traditional consumer business where you can do mass scale A/B tests, 50% in control, 50% in experiment. But with enterprise, especially 0 to 1, you might work with alpha group, beta customer to kind of get their feedback. What's your advice on picking the right sort of first set of initial customer where they will get you representative feedback, not like a power user or some niche use case that make you have to customize all your roadmap around them? How do you choose the right customer?
That especially if you're a startup, that decision will make or break whether your company actually becomes a real Series A, Series B company going IPO or not. And I'll give 2 examples, and we use this terminology called finding the whale customer. A whale looks big, is amazing. So if you're a small company, like, wow, I just signed Coca-Cola or I signed Procter & Gamble, that sounds amazing. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes most early stage companies make when they're signing enterprise customers is they take a whale customer and the whale also works like an anchor and they can drown you. So I think finding the right size, right fit And most importantly, finding a philosophical fit is important. And let me double click into that. And we can use one example from my meta days at Building Workplace, and we'll use one more with Brex as well. So we went with, and now this is public information, so I can share this. We were competing against Microsoft Teams in McDonald's account, and we're like, hey, you should use Workplace. They're like, no, Microsoft wants us to use Teams. I'm like, sounds good. I can spend a lot of energy on this one, or let's not talk about the product. Let's talk about what is it that you're looking for in your solution philosophically. Are you looking for empowerment? Are you looking for end user simplicity, consumer grade ease, or are you looking for, hey, I want managed tight communication? And I think that philosophical conversation unlocked who they should pick, but more importantly, whether we should be going forward with this customer or not. So we took on a whale like customer like McDonald's or Walmart, but we were very careful on making sure that they want philosophically what we want as well. I'll give you another example with Brex right now. We picked DoorDash as one of our early customers. And imagine we normally serve 20 people companies, and we're like, oh, let's go 10,000 people company. But the reason why that worked for us, DoorDash at its heart, it's still a very high growth startup. That's how they operate. They want flexibility, they trust their employees. And finding that fit is extremely critical because we do not want a company which will move slow. We don't want to be in a 2-year deployment cycle. They were like, you give us a drop on Friday, by Monday morning, we'll roll it out. That is extremely critical. So I think finding philosophical fit, finding someone who can move at a high speed and actually really wants to work with you is far more important than the name and the logo or the size of the contract you want to get at the end of it.
I think that's really great to keep in mind. Just on that, I know Rakesh just asked a question, but I'd like to reframe it a little bit. It's a long question, but just say that if you are a product builder working for a company and try to break into all this, trying to sign up for pilot customers, right? Or trying to nail the sales cycle. How can product and sales work better together, such that you actually get a seat in the table, talking to the various potential buyers, get the funding, get them to be excited about trying your product? Versus when there's other competitors, maybe existing solutions, they're working in the org. Like, how can product and sales and marketing maybe work better together to kind of create that relationship, to have that conversation?
Indeed. I think I'll do it, I'll cheat a little bit and then saying, hey, in early stage product, and this could be in a big company or a small company, it doesn't matter. There is no difference between product, sales, and marketing. And it just sounds pretty absurd if you're sitting in a big company. Like, obviously, like I'm a PM and I'm an engineer. But if you go with that approach, you will never, crack into a new market. And this sounds bizarre, but essentially every new product we built, we essentially either jammed the sales leader, the product leader, marketing leader, saying, hey, you're going to work as a trio to get this new business off the ground. In which case, the PM is wearing the hat of a salesperson or pre-salesperson, and the salesperson is going deep into a deployment. Doesn't really matter, because you need that level of conviction into trying out something new and hard. Otherwise, the market is too crowded to ever break through. So first thing will be, hey, if you try to never operate like, hey, they're two separate disciplines with different responsibilities, there's only one responsibility. It's called to win. If you don't want to win, don't do it. The second part, obviously, is, okay, in bigger companies, you have different lines. And that's where your passion and vision really, really makes a difference. So yeah, I've had the same problem at Microsoft. I have to pitch new ideas. So I'm like, hey, what do you need to go do in Azure? And if I started with the business model, the salespeople got excited. If I started with the vision, marketing people got excited. None of them got the customer excited, so it didn't really matter. What the customer got excited was the demo. So start with a demo, show a vision, then show a compelling reason on why the world will be 10x better. And that is how you build backwards from success.
That's awesome. I wanted to start transition a little bit talking about business models. So you mentioned about working, for Azure, like the platform type business, but then you also went into Meta, which focused more on ads. I think Brex, if I'm not mistaken, is transactional SaaS based. Tell us a little bit about how do you think company should think about what type of business model that they should go after. And then there's one question, Yash, that talks about how do you then measure product market fit for enterprise product?
Yeah, actually, Yash, good question, because they are intertwined. Where, yes, PMF normally is retention and usage, which is obviously critical, but also in enterprise, whether your customer will pay for it or not is also a very good signal. So, but let's go back into the question you had, Shivi, which is, what business models and how do you do pricing and how do you get validation? And I'll start with an interesting piece of advice we got with in a Y Combinator class of companies asking about enterprise SaaS pricing. They're like, oh, how much should I charge for my product? And the answer was, charge as much as you can without being laughed out of the room. I'm like, well, okay, that's amazing, and it sounds funnier than like as opposed to like a real advice. But the reality is, you have to think about value creation and value capture as two very distinct activities. And let's break that down. So there are lots of features you will build which will create a lot of value. So people like, for example, at Brex, we're like, hey, we'll build tons of features to make people not have to do expense reports. Everything's automated. We're seeing transactions. We can use AI, and employees love it because the value we're creating is very different, which is extremely low touch, zero friction product. That's not because employees are not paying for the product. Your company is. How you capture value is entirely different. So you're not going to capture value because I gave you more AI, more automation, better app. What you finally make money is value capture part is finance teams having visibility, control, being able to like close books very quickly because employees are not doing the right things. So first thing when you think about enterprise products is write down where you think you're creating value, which will help you drive usage, retention, and differentiation. And then start capturing where is the pain where customer will pay for. And that's what value capture is. And that's where I think the business models really matter. And traditionally, there used to be, oh, I'm going to be a SaaS license fee per user per month. Very typical. I'm sure everyone deals with that. And then we have the other extreme, which is more like Amazon. Hey, I will pay per every minute and every hour of EC2 instance I've used. Both have fits and faults. Obviously, one is great because it's predictable. Because every month you're going to get 1,000 users, $12 a month. It's beautiful. And the problem that is it doesn't scale beyond a point. Because if the company is growing, they're not adding a lot of employees to give you licenses. And the problem with the Amazon model is it doesn't scale because it's only per usage. So the usage goes up and down. It's not predictable. So if you can marry both, that's a holy grail of enterprise SaaS pricing is, can I get both scale with users and scales with usage? I think that's where a hybrid of I have basic user licenses, but more importantly, I also have usage-based scaling. That is like the best of both worlds. You make the most amount of money. But ultimately, before you go into making money, think about, are you creating enough value that people really want to pay for it? And I think back to Yash's question, you will know after usage is when you go back and go for a contract getting signed. Are they willing to pay for it, or are they going to drag their feet? And that's when you know when you're truly happy MF.
That's awesome. I think there's one more question to double click. We usually talk about freemium or free trial as a way, sort of like a teaser to get into like the monetization model, right? How do you think about, where the role of a freemium, a free trial, and I think Elena Verna talk about this reverse trial idea where you opt in automatically into, this pay experience and then hoping then you will stay. What's your role? How do you think about, the role of freemium and use that strategically?
I think it entirely depends on the complexity of trying out your product. And if it's like, hey, you want to reduce the barrier for someone to try out something fundamentally new, with they're like, oh, I just don't even know what this thing could do, and I don't want to pay, a few $100 or even $10 a month to go try it out. Premium is a good way to reduce the activation energy to go try it out. I'll give you a great example. Notion is a great product. I love it. Freemium model works exceptionally well because people are like, oh, I can fundamentally do the product very differently, or do my note taking very differently. But at some point, you do need to cut over. At the same time, if you're selling an enterprise SaaS product like Brex, freemium doesn't really help you, because what are you going to do? They're going to put like a sample test application, and they're like, okay, this is nothing better than anything else I have out there. And actually, freemium hurts you because it'll slow down your sales cycle. They'll never put real workload. So it entirely goes back to the first point we talked about, Chippy, which is you need to know how you're going to sell before you go decide whether you do freemium or not. And I think to Madhvi's point, whether it's sales-led motion or product-led growth motion, really determines. But more importantly, think about how much activation energy is required to try out your product and see value. If the value takes a long time to find and it's very high cost, go the freemium path or go down the free trial path. But If true value will only happen at scale, then freemium will hurt you. So don't do that. And then instead, spend the time, do the pilot, do the deployment, and see people. You get fewer customers, but you'll get high value customers.
I love how you mentioned basically coming back to being very clear about value creation and how you're going to capture that value. So I like that emphasis. And then just how you think about how you sell, like start with the North Star, or like working backwards with like,
Always.
right. That how you sell it before you go. I do wanted to spend the last 5 minutes kind of going into a big part of your experience is about expanding and scaling, business, going into new markets. And we do have someone from, the audience, Sarita, asking you about how do you grow, let's say, an enterprise SaaS that's maybe mature already, in an existing market, and how do you then push it to adjacent market or to emerging market? How do you build that global playbook? How much of it, like which markets should you prioritize, and how much of it you would customize the existing product in order to go into that market versus a pure global playbook and scale fast? What are some thoughts there?
Indeed. I think unlike a lot of consumer businesses, like funny, this at Meta, if you built a product which only 30, 40, 50 million people used, it was considered a failure. So we didn't have an option. And then you interviewed Deb a few months back, and like we started with Deb, it's just like, oh, it's only 50 million people using the product. We need to kill it. And like, wow, like this is very different than what came from Microsoft when I was doing that. But I think it goes back to, you need to identify what total addressable TAM opportunity you're playing in. So for example, for financial services, going global playbook from day one is extremely hard and it's extremely expensive because every country has regulations. But if you're building a SaaS service to do, AI or developer services, there isn't a lot that is stopping you from whether you're sitting in India or sitting in Africa to use your product. So I think a lot of it goes back to what you're offering and how regulated and how expensive it is to have a global playbook. So that's a very critical dimension because you don't, especially as a startup, you do not want to take on the burden of building a global product from day one. However, if you're building a developer service, you have no idea where the innovation is going to come from. And if you start artificially constraining yourself, you'll lose out on massive opportunities to do that. So I think that's one critical dimension, is to think about global, not global. I always ask people to think global first. It needs to be in your DNA because you can't retrofit a lot of things after the fact that easily. So think global first, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need to go build global first. So that's one big differentiation. And I think Sarita's other question is about, how do you go to new products in addition to new markets? I think that's where we have amazing examples from the likes of Microsoft or Google, which is once you are serving a persona in a company, whether it's a knowledge worker in case of Office or a developer, it's far easier to have adjacent use cases which build the core use case than trying to go completely different. A great example is in Office, it's easy to go from Word to PowerPoint to Outlook. And it's really hard even for a giant like Microsoft to go from that suite into a sales tool like Dynamics 365, which is a Salesforce compete. So make sure you understand who you're serving and who you're buying, who's buying your product, and go adjacent in terms of use cases versus trying to go get an entirely new buying motion going because you don't have a lot of synergies there. So applying that in the case of Brex, we started with corporate cards. We're very quickly saying, oh, if you're doing a corporate card, obviously you need to now file an expense report. So the same buyer, we can go to adjacent use case. And now we're like, oh, if you can do expense reports, obviously you want travel. So we're going to go to travel next. And they say, oh, you're going to do this. We'll make it procurement easy. So it's easy to go adjacent use cases. And I see new markets as a z-axis of growth, which is you can always do global. But global is a very expensive decision to make, so make it very carefully.
Yeah, I love that. I love the example, both of the example that you gave around adjacent market versus a completely new sales motion. We're coming up on time. So we, at the end of each show, we usually ask our guests a lightning round of questions. Karan, are you ready for the challenge?
All righty, bring it on.
All right. And so you can answer in 60 seconds or less. First question, what's your current favorite product and why?
My all-time favorites will always remain WhatsApp. So saying that aside, right now I'm in love with Notion because I think it's just a phenomenally well-built product, and they just introduced AI-based text typing. Oh my gosh, my job is half done.
Yeah, I need to try that one out too. The AI enhancement. Second, who would you consider as your the most influential product role model leader who has a big role in your career?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I've been very fortunate to learn from a lot of people. Like Scott Guthrie at Microsoft was amazing. I worked with Deb, Chris, a whole bunch of people at Meta. But if I was to say, hey, who inspires me to think about product more every day is now my 3-year-old. And that sounds interesting because the way she approaches life is through amazing amount of curiosity. For her, everything needs to be solved. Everything needs to be understood. And I think she demonstrates more product thinking than anyone else I see around me. So I think right now my 3-year-old is my inspiration for building products.
That's awesome. The sense of curiosity and empathy, right? Like, how does things work? Asking very fundamental questions. I love that. Okay, now it's time to visit your bookshelf. What is your sort of parting advice or best books that you would recommend product people to read and learn more about how to build great products?
Yeah, if you Google, you'll find like hundreds of recommendations. I think the 3 books, like if you've never done product before, you have to start with is Design of Everyday Things. It's like a 50-year-old book, still true. Creativity Inc., my favorite all-time classic, and Hooked is a version of that, which is like, hey, how do you build? This is like, hey, how do you build the product? How do you measure the product? High growth handbook, and measure what matters, extremely critical. And then the last part is, okay, how do you sell the product? And that's made to stick. I think our all-time classics. But I think more importantly, obviously you'll find these recommendations online, a dime a dozen. But if you also want one blog, Strategy is my favorite right now. Like Ben Thompson writes extremely well, extremely deep. So if you're just curious about a wide range of topics, pay $120 a year. It'll be worth the money.
That's awesome. I like how you break it down by like based on what we talk about too, right? And what you build, how you build it, how do you sell it? That's pretty important too. I love Made to Stick and Creativity and Cook, a lot of the ones that you recommend. So thank you so much. All right,
Awesome.
we're coming up on time. I think this has been a really, really jam-packed, value-packed session. I hope to dive deeper into some of those, but maybe we need to invite you back for another deep dive, Karan. And for folks who are joining us today, please make sure you subscribe to our newsletter so that you can get a recap of some of the key takeaways from today's session. And I hope to see many of you in 2 weeks. We didn't have a show next Friday, but I'll see you in 2 weeks. And thank you so much, Karan, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Shivi. Pleasure.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.